Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Mr. Neufeld. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. Can you please introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Yes, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Matthew Neufeld. My job is to teach history, so I'm a historian. I work at the University of Saskatchewan, which is in Western Canada, and I teach primarily British history and some European history. The time period that I focus on primarily is what's called early modern, and that's from about 1500 to 1800. And I've been at the University of Saskatchewan now for 11 years.
What attracted you to that certain time period?
Good question. With two things. One, I guess, has to do sort of with my background. I grew up as a part of a relatively small-ish religious ethnic community called Mennonites. And the Mennonites trace their origin to the Reformation period in European history. They are part of what is sometimes called the Radical Reformation. And so I guess partly I was interested in that time period because that was the sort of the origin point of the community in which I grew up. I think it was also interesting to me because it seemed to have a very potent, that is the time period, a very potent and I thought pertinent mix of issues to do with religion and politics. And that's interested me. So I guess the two things, the sort of personal angle and then the sort of broader, maybe we could say philosophical or ideological angle. And that, to make it a bit more concrete, I suppose I was interested in, as a young person, what difference do people's beliefs make for how they live out in the world. So for example, and this relates a bit to what I teach and research now, questions of war and what is war and can war ever be justified? If so, on what basis? And then relatedly, is it permissible, is it allowable for Christians in this point to participate in warfare? And that's a part of a long debate that has produced different answers at different times in the past.
What's your perspective on war? I know like people make their own, like I just know from, I had a guest who talked about the myth of the German soldier, and it got me interested in looking into the World War II, the Germany letters that these soldiers were writing. And some of them didn't agree with Adolf Hitler, but the way that they would justify their actions to, sending a letter to a family member back home was by saying it was like a religious thing, or trying to find something like I had to kill this person because they had clothes I needed or they had food I needed. And it's just like, we'll do anything possible to justify the action of doing something like that.
Yes, that gets to a very, very deep and a very, for some people, contentious question, and that is, why do people fight? And what is the basis of war? So, but I won't go into that right now. I want to answer your question, and that was what do I think? My mind has changed over time. I think when I was in my teens and 20s, maybe even into my early 30s, I would have called myself a pacifist or somebody who was committed to the principle of non-resistance. What that meant was that I thought that although perhaps sometimes governments or states might find reasons to go to war with each other and to call up people to join or to serve in their militaries and engage in warfare, that Christians in particular were called to renounce violence, to live lives of peace. And even if that meant in a time of war to suffer and die because of the outcome of a war, that was sort of the calling of Christians to embrace the way of peace. have some come to change my opinion on that. I think now I would, or I don't think, I now am more convinced of the just war tradition as it has come down to us through classical thinkers, Roman thinkers, and then Christian thinkers like Augustine and I believe people like Thomas Aquinas, so that there are sometimes, in certain instances, justified reasons for going to war, and for people of various religious confessions and none to participate in war, and to do so in a way that's justifiable and legitimate.
Like World War II would be a good example of obviously something that's justifiable because you have one person that's a little bit off their rocker in a sense, and everyone kind of has to step in. But I mean, the way that we've battled has changed. I mean, I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, it's early Britain where they had like rules on how you would duel, basically, take 5 paces or take 6 paces. There was like a polite war in a sense, which was like there's rules and there's terms. And then it eventually just got to this point where there was like, we're just going to try and win, and that's the basis. There's no taking turns.
Yes, well, there are something like dueling is very much tied to the idea that there are proper or correct ways of behavior between people of the same social status or social class. And dueling is also very much tied to, from my understanding, tied to an idea, or if a culture is based particularly on ideas of honor and shame. And so and also, if you're in a society or a culture where there are very strong and highly developed ideas of honor or shame, or what we might translate into ideas of respect and disrespect, and if also, if you're in a society or in a culture where there isn't a police force, where there isn't a strong central government that's there to resolve problems, where there aren't a regular court a system, a legal system where people trust that if something happens to them, if someone attacks them or someone insults them, that they can take their problem or the issue to a court and will get justice there. In societies where those things don't exist, a court system, a police system, then if you or your family have an injury done to you, the way you respond is by fighting back or hitting back, and then rules develop around that. And so dueling is partly a product of those scenarios. And yes, they could become very ritualized and become very tied up with a whole bunch of rules, partly as a way of trying to keep the violence, to keep the duel from spiraling. Because what what people generally don't want to happen or try to avoid is from an injury or an insult becoming something like a feud or a clan war, which is very, very hard to stop. Because anytime that there's an injury or someone is killed, then the honor demands that there be some kind of action, similar action done against the other side. And then the other side has to respond, and then it becomes an uncontrollable spiral.
Now, when we talk about, I guess, the justifications for war, did you come like this seems like a different road than just studying the Reformation period. Does it relate in there though? Was there like some type of connecting line that had you also look into this aspect, or?
Well, I haven't done a sort of systematic study of the just war ideas or the just war tradition. But what I understand is that, or the arguments that are made for why sometimes war is justified make sense to me. So if there's a grievous injustice, if there's been, let's say, a nation has been attacked or invaded without warning, then there's a right to self-defense. If so, that would, I guess, be one example of a justified war. And then another, I guess, a condition of a just war is that it's undertaken, or that it's directed by a legitimate authority, so by a government that's properly constituted. So in other words, private citizens don't have the right to, or shouldn't have the right to, gather together armies and then make war on other people within their country or people outside of their country. That would be another thing. Another principle would be sort of just means, or that at an appropriate level of force. So initially, I guess the idea is that you, in a war, you wouldn't, you try to keep, similar to with duels, you try to keep the level of violence as sort of minimal as possible, and avoid trying to avoid things escalating out of control. So what does that mean concretely, for example? Well, in a war, generally it's accepted that soldiers, the enemy soldiers, are fair game, but non-combatants, civilians, should be left alone because they are not part of the conflict.
Did you ever look into the evolution when it came to like biological weapons and chemical warfare that started happening? Like it was always interesting to me that everyone agreed to like ban those, or at least ban the use of it, like the Geneva Convention. You know, this idea of like these are kind of unethical to use in war. And I just think that's interesting because even there are stopping points where you realize you are going down kind of like a, I mean, nuclear weapons are a good example, a nuclear test ban treaty. I mean, that's a game winner, but I think everyone realizes the change that that could have an impact. Even if you win a war, are you really winning?
Yes, I have not looked at biological or nuclear weapons and the difference that they made, for how war is sort of justified or how it's conducted. I have done a little bit of investigation into the origin of the Geneva Convention in the middle of the 19th century. It's an interesting story. It's tied to the beginning of the Red Cross. A Genevan, so someone from Switzerland, was on a business trip, and along the way to wanting to have a meeting with the French emperor, came across a battle scene, and or the aftermath of a battle, and then worked in a hospital for I think it was 3 days. And he came, I'm afraid I'm blanking on his name, but he came up with the idea of creating some kind of organization that would be dedicated to helping the sick and wounded soldiers of both sides of a combat, and that sort of there would be this zone of neutrality where the sick and wounded soldiers from whatever side would receive treatment, would receive care. And that idea then became part, or one of the principles that was discussed at the first two Geneva Conventions in the 1860s. And part of the rationale, I think, or part of the sort of underlying story of what was going on with the Geneva Convention, is that people began to understand in the middle of the 19th century, as with the American Civil War and with wars in Europe between, say, the Prussians and the Danish, or the Prussians and the Austrians, that if you mix industrialization, industrial production, so mass production of weapons, with a commitment to always improving, making more efficient, more effective weapons, what you do potentially is you escalate the means of violence, escalate the means of killing, so that suddenly the removal of constraint of killing is possible. And so I think there's a connection between the introduction of if we think about the Geneva Convention as an attempt to put constraints on the means of violence, and to create these spaces where violence is prohibited. So hospitals, for example, the idea that once a soldier or a combatant is wounded or sick, that he is no longer a combatant, and so enemy combatants should receive medical care just like one's own combatants. So I think there's an interesting sort of, I don't quite know how to paradox perhaps, between technological changes that suggest that suddenly the limit of killing is, or the constraints on killing are being more and more sort of raised, and then attempts to address that by trying to put limits on who can be killed, and that sort of thing.
Is it interesting to you or shocking at all the fact that someone could immediately put down the arms that this person was my enemy if they're injured and start treating them? like that's a difficult thing to do. I noticed that during like people that were in Vietnam that were prisoners of war, maybe people that were on, if they had a resistance force and they had an American trooper in there. There's a famous story about it where these two became friends. One person couldn't even move. The other person was feeding him and taking care of him. And I think they're still alive today. I think they just wrote a book about it not too long ago. And that's just interesting how you can, you're so inflated to literally go to war and shoot these people that are deemed your enemy. And then you're willing to drop all that when you start noticing the more human aspect that someone's hurt.
Yes. Well, I think it's there are maybe one way to think about that is that human beings have the to be human is to have the potential both to treat the enemy as someone like yourself, and to treat the enemy as someone like you, and I guess you could say could have empathy or compassion, and show treat the person with dignity, and also the capacity to think of the other person as not human and not worthy of dignity and not worthy of respect. And sometimes that, so I think both capacities are in all people, maybe not in this to the same extent, and it varies by time, and it also varies by conflict. um, and so you can have a really good book you might be interested in about this question to do with prisoners is by a man named Wayne Lee, who looked at warfare in North America between colonists and Native Americans, and how they had different, because they had different approaches to, say, prisoners of war, and weren't able to understand the traditions of prisoners of war or taking prisoners of the other. And this led to, on the one hand, a mutual sort of misunderstanding, and points where you could have, say, during the, he vividly describes this scenario during the American Revolutionary War, where uh, America, well, they would have been not quite Americans, but I guess it depends on, but soldiers of the Patriot Army would show tremendous respect and dignity to captured British troops, and yet they would show horrendous violence, or practice horrendous violence on enemy Native American troops. And these are the same guys, the same men who are willing to show mercy to their European foes, but not to Native American foes. And it's too simple to say that it's just racism. There's more going on to it, more of the history of the interactions between the colonists and Native Americans. So in a way, I'm not surprised that from the same person you can get acts of what we would call tenderness, compassion towards an enemy, but then maybe in another setting, in another war, uh, tremendous animosity and sort of unthinking brutality.
That would depend on, I'm guessing, the time of the conflict as well, too. Like if you have a war that's kind of just starting out, not a whole lot of damage has been done, like it's just beginning, there's still that hesitation factor. But then it's like a couple of years in, there's not really a hesitation. But then you're in a war so long, let's say 13 years, 12 years or something. And then the people that are fighting now are like, why the hell are we fighting?
So a lot of the worst notorious incidents of violence happened when cities or fortresses were stormed by the attacker, and it was sort of a, a well, a given, or it was understood that if a city was stormed, the residents of the city, both the soldiers and the non-combatants, could suffer terrible violence. So it happened in Ireland when the English invaded in 1649 in the town of Drogheda and Wexford, which is still remembered. The city of Magdeburg in 1632-33, I believe, when Catholic forces stormed a Protestant city. So yeah, these there would be, yeah, often the sooner, and I'll just repeat what I said before, but if a city was being besieged, the sooner it surrendered, the easier its residents got off, and the less chances that they would suffer terrible violence if they ended up holding out and then being stormed by their attackers.
So kind of not the same as a morale issue. Like we know that keeping morale up high, a lot of stuff to keep morale going is important to make sure your troops can keep fighting and still think that, even if they're unbeatable odds, they can become beatable in a sense. But at this point, if you're laying siege to a place and people knew that they weren't going to win, would it have been easier for them to just give up and take the lesser, due course of action?
Yes. Well, from the point of view of the defenders, if they're holding out, they're probably holding out and refusing to surrender because the hope is that help is on the way, that friends or allies are on the way to relieve them and to lift the siege, and so they don't have to surrender. On the point of view of the attackers, by the time the advantage, as you probably know, if the advantage is always with the defender. The defender is behind the wall. The defender has a clearer line of sight. So by the time, depending on the length of the siege and how many of the attacking forces had been killed or maimed and wounded, if you, let's say you'd been besieging a city for months and months and you'd seen a number of your friends blown up beside you or horribly maimed, particularly in the 16th and 17th century when they're using muskets, which are shooting true balls of lead, which are terrible because they tend to flatten on impact and then they drag dirt and clothing into wounds, and they also leave massive internal cavities. So in other words, being shot by a musket ball is a pretty terrible thing compared to bullets today, which are smaller and jacketed. Not that being shot today is anything to want to happen. So morale, if you're an attacker, the longer the attack lasts, the more you want it to end, and perhaps the more revenge you want to take on the people who are besieging. The defenders are fighting because they don't want to be stormed. They know that if the fortress falls, they could face horrendous violence. So, and that maybe ties back to your, I don't know the sources that you're referring to about German soldiers in the Second World War. I suspect that for many of them by 1944, early 1945, they didn't they weren't stupid. They didn't, well, they probably didn't think that the war was going to be winnable anytime soon. So when they're fighting, what they're fighting for are the people behind them or the people who are fighting beside them. And so they're one way to understand maybe what was going on in the mind of some, but not all, but some German soldiers in the Second World War was similar to the sort of thinking that people defending a fortress or a city under siege in the 16th and 17th century. So it's not, they're fighting to protect a territory, a place. They're fighting for the people they're with, they're fighting for their comrades. And it becomes less about the ideology or the government and more about stopping worse violence from happening.
When it comes, I just have a quick question about the ideology. How big was the ideology, I guess, a motivator back then? I know, like, I've learned about the Vikings coming over and kind of being upset with Christianity and doing a lot of things on that sort, but also, I mean, communism is an ideology, and that's a lot of wars that were more modern day as well, too.
Mhm. Well, I think it was a motivating factor, and there's not everybody agrees on the degree to which ideology or belief or let's say religion was a reason for people when they were actually fighting. I think it can be a rationale for why people maybe signed up or why they joined, and it's a religion is a particularly in the after the Reformation in Europe. It's a marker, another way of distinguishing us and them. And it also was a, because it became linked to questions of sort of, this is a kind of anthropological idea, but sort of purity and danger. and the others are people who threaten not only what we think, but our way of life, and connected to ultimate questions of good and evil. And so I would say that certainly for some people, for some rulers, uh, it made sense to fight for religious reasons, um, to protect what they understood to be true and right. And there are parallels, I think, to 20th century wars. It's just the question of purity and danger wasn't so much the thing that was sacred wasn't maybe the confession or the church, but it was more the country or the people. And you get us. I mean, when we talk about things like war, we use words like invasion, penetration, incursion, and these are terms that we also use, interestingly enough, in when we talk about medicine. And we use military metaphors when we talk about things like pandemics or epidemics. We talk about creating zones of, well, safe spaces. We talk about creating a boundary between the threat and between us. And we want to remove or separate out people who are threatening us or threatening our health or threatening our way of life. So I think there are this is a long way of saying, I think there are parallels, there are overlaps between the ideas that people had in their minds in the early modern period for why they would fight, why it was important to either attack or to defend, and and there are parallels to the 20th century wars as well, and even 21st century wars also.
A lot of people wouldn't consider it a success. I consider it a success just because it ran for so long. But the Ottoman Empire, they had a large influence of Christian people, Catholic people, Islam, and seeing that all work together. Even though there was might have been some minor conflicts and things of that sort, but the overall ideology that kind of took over to where we even have religious um, sanctions now, or religious countries that are just a religious state. That's what they call it. This is the place of this, and it's kind of reduced into corners and stuff. But that's, I mean, ideology was such a big motivator back in the day compared to how it is today.
Yes. Yeah. One thing that I try to get across to my students, which isn't always easy to do, is that one of the distinguishing things about Western Europe, or the sort of the successor states of the Western Roman Empire, is the idea that there are two domains of authority, two domains of governance. One is politics, the sort of temporal area, and the other is religion or the church. So the idea that there are these two domains, church and state, is a Western invention. And in almost all other ancient civilizations, and to be, I think, in contemporary civilizations, there isn't that split. There isn't anything like the division between church and state. So in something like the Ottoman Empire, the governance of the empire is out and out an Islamic empire, and it's following to a greater or lesser extent Islamic law. And so within that law, it's able, and because of the genius or the cleverness of the Ottomans, they were able to patch together, a multinational empire, taking sort of the best people from the different religious groups and ethnic groups living within them. And so long as the people that they conquered more or less respected the Ottoman emperor's authority, didn't try to rebel, they were generally left alone. And that's a model that, to an extent, the Romans also used successfully. So one thing that is perhaps surprising to modern people is that in the ancient world, and even up into, say, the medieval and in the modern world, the most successful diverse societies, quote unquote, tended to be empires. And so in the 19th century, when nationalism and the idea that nations, that peoples who have a similar language, a similar religion, uh, deserve their own state, that was a, for some people, a strange idea. and it's also tied in complicated ways to democracy, particularly in Europe, and so it seems to be the case that you can have a diverse society that's also that where people more or less get along. That's also an empire. That, in fact, yeah, as to sort of sum up, that seems to be the more so the case historically than, say, a country that has where everybody or almost everybody is more or less the same in terms of language and religion. That's less common historically, and as we also saw in the 20th century, it tends to run into problems, because what happens if there's a minority population within that national state? And so the classic example would be what you do with Jewish people. And are Jewish people, is it a religion, or is it a sort of a political organization? And so the French Revolution had one answer, then in Germany there was one answer in the 19th century, and then sort of catastrophic answers in the 20th century.
I would have thought being Jewish was a religion, but then I took a blood test and they're like, "You're Ashkenazi." I was like, "What is that?" And they're like, "Well, it's Jewish people." And I was just like, "Oh, wait, so it is a blood thing as well too. I didn't know that." But when it comes to the Ottoman Empire, how much weight do you put in the fact that maybe the Ottoman Empire actually kind of crumbled when they ended up expanding too far, like expanding too much, that maybe they couldn't hold it all down, but also home turf advantage. I mean, the people that are Christian that were inside of the Ottoman Empire, I have to think if there's a nation that's battling you, I mean, it's like you can talk trash on your town. I can talk trash on my town, but if someone else does it, we immediately get defensive on it. And it's like this blind. So, I mean, there's weight in that, right? That's not crazy to say that there could be this home turf advantage influence based on maybe a Christian population or something like that, that maybe no.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think that you're raising a very important and a difficult issue, and that is trying to make sense of where do people's loyalty lie, what takes priority, what takes precedent, and why do they put certain things at the top of their, I guess, their allegiance or their loyalty instead of others. So there were unquestionably Christian peoples who were conquered by the Ottomans and then subsequently made peace with their conquest or their conquerors, and found ways to work with the Ottomans in questions of government, and were even willing to fight with the Ottomans against other Christians, against other groups. Now, some of it was there were pre-existing divisions among Christians between Catholics and Orthodox, for example, that went back to the 10th, 11th century. So an Orthodox Christian, a Serb, for example, might feel that he has more in common with an Ottoman Muslim in holding animus, or not wanting to work with a Catholic Christian, and vice versa. So as to why the empire collapsed, it could be, I don't, I now I'm sort of just going on a sort of impressionistic basis. I'm not an expert on the Ottoman Empire, um, but it could be that it had stretched its resources too far in the 18th century. There are also questions about the extent to which the Ottomans were willing or not to adopt external technologies. Um, but I think as a I would agree with you that as far as the duration of the Ottoman Empire, it's a very successful political project, and it lasted for centuries, far longer than, and was maybe more coherent in some ways than other European empires from the same time.
I uh I think what's the old saying that there's many reasons to go to war. That I would put the political, not even that's just a political ideology, but just a religious ideology probably higher up on the totem pole. More maybe back in the day when it was more apparent that more people obviously identify with their religious beliefs. And I think at today's age, a lot more people are probably atheist. than it was way back in the day, especially. But I mean, there's many reasons to go to war, and a lot of this was this ideology. Is this country an enemy of mine? Is this country getting too big? Is it taking up too much space and we don't want them to be too big? But also the religious reasons. I mean, do these people, are you able to demonize them in your head so much because they don't follow the same religion as you? And I always thought that was very interesting. It never really gets, at least from, historical standards, I would say, from people I've talked to who've studied certain time periods, that never really gets the main focus, which I feel like it needs to get a little bit more weight in. I think it's because we are so disconnected from that religious aspect today, at least my generation is. It's not easily communicated to that understanding, but I was like, we have to find a way to be able to talk about. I'm not religious at all, but we have to at least talk about that because you have to understand that is a motivator.
Yeah. Oh, I agree, and it's linked up with other things too. That and religion is it's for people living before the modern era. It's not only something that you do on your own terms, on your own time, sort of privately, but it's very much a sort of it's a public identity, and it's sort of like it's like national citizenship is today for people. And it has to do with ultimate questions about what's real, what's good, uh, who's a good person, am I a good person, what's a good life, am I well off. And so now we tend to go to different places, different authorities today than religious authorities for those answers. Um, so unquestionably, I think it's important that even though for today, for many people, religion isn't important, it's important to think too that people in the past, religion was important. They maybe didn't think about religion in the same way that we do. And so one of my jobs as a historian is to help my students and to help other people think about why people would get so worked up about questions that to us seem to be sort of arcane or silly. Why people would feel so strongly about them that they would be willing to fight for them. One example that we could maybe that I sometimes that I have used or thought about using is the idea of human rights. So why is it that people today are worked up about human rights? Why is it that some people would suggest or do suggest that in the name of human rights, countries in the Western world should intervene in the affairs of other countries, perhaps with force or otherwise? Why are human rights so important to us? Where do human rights come from? What's the origin of them? What's the foundation of them? And I think if I ask students that sort of question, why are you first of all, what are human rights? Where do they come from? What's their basis? And why do you think they're important for everybody? Then I think people, my students, I hope, begin to think about how perhaps people in the past thought about religious beliefs or religious ideologies in that way. I think too, there are always going to be people who are interested in war because war is an adventure and war is an activity. It's a high risk activity that does for some people promise a certain kind of reward. I think there are people who are always going to be willing to assume high risk activities, and that's partly the culture, the society in which they're from, and I think it also has to do with personality type. So I mean, today there are people who engage in extreme sports, who do things that are that put themselves and their bodies at risk. And I think in the past and even today, there might have been those kinds of people, I'll call them kinds of people who have a higher tolerance for risk would have been the sorts of people who would have signed up for a war, whatever the reason, if it was a dynastic war, a diplomatic battle, or something to do with an invading army, an invading empire, or a confessional religious war.
Do you find that your students understand like trying to guess your perspective on war, or maybe trying to understand, because like I look at it from two sides, and I've talked to both sides of it. I talked to people who said no more wars, and I've talked to people like wars needed, and you just kind of get this rounded out perspective out of all the people I've talked to on various sides of different issues, where I'm starting to realize like we're always going to have conflict. I would relate war to just a simple conflict of someone getting pissed off while they drive. I mean, you don't know why you're getting pissed off, but it's just force of habit. It's happening. And when we're disconnected from war, I think that's what makes a lot of European wars more interesting. Like my friends from Bulgaria and Romania, essentially they're still connected to someone who fought in one of those giant wars. They've had it, and America hasn't had one on their home turf. Hasn't, besides maybe a terroristic attack or something like that, or Pearl Harbor or something. But there's that disconnect where it's kind of like the example I would use would be renewable energies. My town wanted wind power, and when they go, okay, we're going to build it 2 miles off the coast, and I live in a beach town, so there's a nice beach. And then people are like, well, I don't want it here. Can you build it somewhere else? And people complain because they had to look at it. It was going to obstruct their view. So I go, people are more than happy to have something happen or be disconnected from something when it's not in their everyday life, when it's not in their purview. And I think trying to understand that, and you can get mad at the reasons we do go to war. I have controversial issues of why we're in Vietnam. But you're gonna have a lot of takes on a lot of different things, but it's about understanding why and maybe not making the same mistake before. And it's something interesting where there's a thing called the Venus Project, and it's this idea of a utopia that all countries could just work together instead of fighting or having these bickering and these kind of, you know, embargoes on each other, whatever. It's just this idea of peace. We're all one species working towards one goal. And I was like, that's so off this timeline, because all we do is we do want what someone else has. And you watch the evolution of going to battle, changing from sieges to wars to now everything's online, cybersecurity and hacks. There's just this paranoia, jealousy fuel that is just a part of us. And that's what's so interesting if you look in the era of espionage. Like you're not weapons weren't fired, at least visually, but there was a lot of interesting and kind of secretive styles and maneuvers of tactics just to try to do anything to make sure you have the upper hand on your opponent. And that is fascinating.
Yes, yes. Well, all of the things that you said, they make sense, and I think when I talk to my students, I try one of the things I spend a week talking about sort of what I think to be, and I use a wonderful book on war by an Israeli scholar named Amor Gat, Gat. He would, if you ever want to talk to someone about sort of the evolutionary implications of war, he would be a fantastic guest. And and he makes the point, which I think is right, that aggression is something is it's part of being human. It's something that's innate in us. But it's not like the desire for food or sex. It's something that's innate, but it's optional. So if there's are ways for us to get the things that we want and need, and in the sort of the baseline early human environment, the things that we want to need are, we want food, and we want to need to reproduce. And if fighting, if aggression will help us get those things, then we're more likely to use them. Today, as I tell my students, you don't have to go past a machine gun nest to get to Safeway to get food. You don't have to beat up your neighbor to put a profile up on Tinder. So we have it doesn't make sense. Or in my workplace, if I want something to happen, and there's somebody maybe who's opposing me, or who's questioning what I want done, it doesn't do me any good to hire a hitman to take that person out and solve my problem. I'm able to solve the problem, or at least enact some kind of, perhaps a compromise, through talking and through working with channels of discussion and interpersonal Yeah, interpersonal engagement. So in our world, thanks to the tremendous advances that we've made in things like policing, in our law courts, and in the institutions that we have, which do have rules and procedures in place to deal with conflict, which, and I agree with you, we are always going to have conflict with people because we have different, we're individuals, and individuals sometimes get along but often don't get along, and that starts, I would say, even in our families. If you see groups of 2 and 3 year old kids playing together and there's a limited number of toys, they're not on their own instantly going to share the things that they have. So yeah, I think war is something that we can we can take steps as individuals and as countries to mitigate it, to make it less destructive, um, to make it less viable as an option. But I think countries and states are always going to keep war as an option to get the things that they want.
This is going to kind of be a weird question, I would say, but would you also raise up the fact of maybe values, not talking about maybe religious, but just how people are raised? Like I always bring up the example, like when people talk about this number of people died every year in our country or this, I'm like, yo, you got to think about all the, like the fact that we're all so different and we're all right next to each other, basically on top of each other 24/7, constantly moving around each other 24/7. Like, that's amazing if you really look at when people start talking for most of the time longer than 5 minutes or so. I mean, the conversations now are boiled down through text, which probably creates a lot of problems as well too. But you have this new generation that's coming up that's kind of based in new values and looking at a lot of things. And change happens over time. It is a slow pace, which they want it to be. They want it to be faster, and it's understood. But it's also this aspect of like you're always, as much as you're going to have conflict with some tyrannical force or something like that, you're going to have the same conflict when everything goes your way as well too. It's this idea of peace. There is that peace, and I believe there's been great voices in American history that have spoken about peace and have been revolutionary. But it's you're also it's like a game. It's why, like, I don't like court systems. Lawyers aren't really looking for the answer of the truth. It's more like, I wanna win, I don't wanna lose. And so you're gonna be less likely to look at evidence that's against your client. You'll be more happy to talk about the things that would admonish him. And it's I mean, it's same thing with the debates in America. It's just 2 people shouting at each other where it's like, you gotta kind of look at these and you gotta understand like this is no matter what the platform is, no matter what the time period is, no matter what if there's nothing going on, we're going to find some way to have a conflict or do something. That's why during the Cold War is so fascinating because you can't use a weapon and everyone's afraid it's going to happen, but you got secret agents working with poison pens and things of sort where you're just like, what is happening?
Yes, yes. Yeah, I think so. I think if I understood what you're saying rightly, even sort of back to this, the idea you mentioned about the Venus Project, or the idea that I guess if we perhaps if we just make the right laws, or set up enough of the right institutions and have the right rules, that people will live together and will get along, and there won't be problems. It's the idea that if you and it gets to some pretty deep questions, I think, about what it is to be a human being, and are human beings sort of innately good, and they just need to grow up in the right environment, and then to have the right environment later in their adults, and then they won't have conflict? Or is the story more complicated, in that human beings are a mix of these things, of what we would perhaps call good and not so good tendencies, and that even if you have structures in place that maybe minimize the destructive qualities, you'll still have, as you say, you'll still have conflict. I tend to be more on the side of the, yes, structures and the environment are important, but I think human beings are the sort of creature that, yeah, there will always be conflict. There'll always be the potential for violence.
I lean on that side as well too, and I think a good example, which is kind of a double standard, would be the fact that we usually go to war about is the fact that someone is different or someone isn't. We want everything to kind of go like how your day goes. Like if you have your friends because they're your friends, right? You probably agree with more things that they say. Your life is kind of set up, your family, the people you choose to hang out with, the people you choose to mate with is because you like things about them, but also they relate kind of similar to you. And that's how your life kind of goes interacting with everything that kind of agrees with you. That's why it's different to talk to someone who doesn't agree with you because it's kind of like it usually turns into an argument. Well, war is kind of the sense of if they're a communist, we're Democrats or we're democracy. We're trying to fix that communism, which is you go to war for. And it's really weird because where I say it's a double standard is the new generation wants a political or not political, but they want the identity. And I'm like, the identity also, it gets so specific and detailed. We all know like there's writers clubs and things on Twitter. Well, they go very specific, sci-fi only writers club. Then it gets even more specific than that. And it's like the more we detail and we try and fit in with more groups, we're also isolating from the thing that also dehumanizes the other person in a sense as well, too, is that this is my group, you're not a part of it. And then that also can lead to a conflict. So it's like where I say it's a double standard is it's kind of like you we go to war on the basis of a difference or something in opinion in political ideology and religious ideology, but also we're trying to identify and use that as our biggest characteristic, which is like it's just interesting to me. I mean, like I said, it's my opinion here, but to me, I think it's fascinating to see that because I think even with this idea of wanting peace or this, it's like, but most people now, especially in the States, identify themselves with a political party before they even choose to associate with you. And I'm like, that's where the issue is now you're going to enjoy your side and you're not actually going to get to know who that person is.
Hmm. Yes. Well, I think you're hinting at a problem that other people much smarter than I have talked about, and that's the question of tribalism. And to what extent is it are the difficulties in politics today in many countries a result of people finding it more important to, as you say, identify with people with sort of their group, their tribe. And to what extent is that identity a negative identity in the sense that to belong to group X, I belong to group X because I and other people hate group Y. And so we're not like those other people who are for one reasons 1, 2, and 3 wicked, evil, deluded, stupid, that kind of thing. That's hard to that's hard to overcome. I think there are a couple of things going on in what you're talking about. One is that I think there is a human desire to belong to something greater than our particular, to belong to have a connection, part of a family, to be part of a community, to be part of a nation, to be part of a bigger movement or story that gives a kind of meaning to life. And any group by definition is going to have people who are inside and people who are outside. That's just the nature of groups. And the question or a question related to that is, so how do you, as an individual in the group and interacting with people who are outside, how do you interact? What's your attitude or what's your stance towards people who are outside and who are different? Are the borders, is the group founded also on the idea that there are sort of things in the center that draw people into it, and or is it the idea that the group is defined by a sort of strong wall around the outside, and it's important to keep that wall up and strong to make sure that the outsiders don't get in? Now, it's a one of the geniuses of, or the one of the, I guess we could say, the blessings of modern politics was that, or it understood itself to have set up systems where differences of opinion would be resolved by talking and by voting, and then accepting the results of the debate and the vote, and then not resorting to violence. Because in the past, differences, the easiest way to solve a difference, as I hinted at before, is to eliminate your opponent uh, by killing them. Um, and as this, who knows, the world that we're in now, as the stakes get higher for people, as the stakes get higher for groups, if you or your group are unwilling to have your opponents or your adversaries in power, in government or otherwise, then the likelihood of violence increases, because if it becomes intolerable to live under the government of somebody that you hate or think is wicked, then the options for, or the capacity for living in peace with people who are different, that diminishes. So I think things like belonging, things like identity, in and of themselves are understandable and good, and but they have a dark side, or they have a flip side. And so any team, there are going to be people who make the team and those who don't. And any group, there are people who are in and who are out. So you mentioned, that these writers groups, or I mean, you think about other sorts of groups that people form identity around, say, knitting clubs or book clubs or other sorts of things. And
We could have picked a way easier, funner example, which is like film club or something, but we went right to the knitting and all the old school stuff.
yeah, exactly. So there's potential for good. There's potential for um, for building you. It's much easier to get through life if you don't have to rely on yourself alone. I mean, you probably know from talking to other people, that there's a horrendous problem now in modern societies in North America of loneliness, of people who have no friends, or who have very few friends, and don't know what friendship means. And there are different reasons for that, to do with their background, with family structures, with people being mobile, having to go elsewhere for work, and the fact that so much interaction now happens via a screen. And I'm delighted to talk to you, Rob, and I'm very pleased to meet you. To be honest, I would much rather be having this conversation with you over a beer in your pub. I love Maryland. I've been there only a couple of times, but it's a delightful place, and I would love to have you here. And I'm grateful for the media that allow us to talk and share ideas. But I'm the sort of person who prefers real presence. And if you're really with somebody, that is, you're present to them, they're sort of embodied, it becomes less about the ideas, and it becomes much more about you as a person. And I think it's more difficult to yeah, it becomes more difficult. You can still disagree with people. You can still think that they're wrong or misguided for what they think and what they propose. But it's more difficult to despise somebody, to hate somebody, if you're confronted with them in the flesh, so to speak, in person.
Well, there's a quote that, hatred, or was it bitterness is the friend of hatred or something like that. And then there's another quote that's a more modern day one, which is that I keep my circle small because I'd rather have 4 quarters than 100 pennies. And it's just the aspect of, would you rather have 100 friends that you can't count on, or would you rather have 4 friends that you can? People, the era of conversation's got to make a comeback at some point. I'm hoping that, enough people hop on the trend, but I get it, because people are afraid of getting hurt as well too. The reason why there's communities and there's specific groups is to eliminate trollers, or people that are just joining that just want to make fun and stir up a mess. And you'll always have those people in our society, but you'll also have people that like to connect as well too.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And these things, they sort of they move up different levels of social reality, from individuals to friends to families to communities. and they're not exactly the same. You don't interact with the relations that occur between friends and families are not the same as relations between nations and countries, but there are similarities. And one of the things that I also try to, getting back to the history that I teach, um, in a sense, in the medieval and the early modern periods, politics was personal in a way that it's different today, because politics, it was done by fewer people than it is today. We're not talking about democracies, and the people who were involved in politics represented maybe 1 to 2% of the whole population. And the most important political decisions were made by a handful of people at the top around the ruler. Let's say in a kingdom, it would be the king and the council, or the queen and the council. And so the personality of the monarch made a difference for politics. The fact that, now I'll drop a name, James the First of England was the sort of person who, he became King of England in 1603, and he understood himself to be a kind of an intellectual and somebody who was going to try to encourage conversation, dialogue among the rulers of Europe, to try to bring some kind of peace after the religious wars of the 16th century. So he understood himself to be a peacemaker, and one way that he demonstrated that was through the marriages of his children. So he married his daughter to a Protestant prince, and he was trying to get his son, his eldest son, surviving son, married to a Catholic princess, and hoping that this sort of, by these marriage unions, he would be fostering peace and cooperation in Europe. Unfortunately, his daughter married Elector Frederick of the Palatinate, who then in 1618 was elected King of Bohemia, which kicked off the 30 Years' War, which was the worst, was sort of Europe's first total war, devastating for Central Europe. So these, we can talk about all of that to say that the personal, politics is personal. I don't think that the personal is political. I think that's a prelude to a sort of totalitarian view of politics. But I think personalities maybe is another way of saying that. Personality matters for both how politics happens, how war happens. It also affects how people approach the question of war and violence. And so I think that, for example, the personalities of generals matters for how campaigns turns out. I think the personalities of individuals who think about whether or not war is inevitable matters. So we can think about these questions that are at a pretty high level, with tools that we use for also thinking about our interpersonal relations, our relations with friends and family.
Well, Matt, I really appreciate the time you've given me to do my show. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. You're welcome back anytime. Is there a
Thanks
place
for
where
having me.
is there a place where people can find your links? Do you have a Twitter? Do you have any books out there, a website?
I'm on Twitter, but I don't tweet about my work. I'm on there mostly to sort of lurk and see what other people are doing. But if you look up Matthew Neufeld, University of Saskatchewan, you come to my webpage, and that talks. Then people can see the sort of things that I've published and the things I teach about. So I'm working on a book about naval healthcare that should come out in a couple of years, hopefully. And maybe the next time we meet, we can talk about how the Royal Navy in England looked after sick and injured sailors between 1650 and 1750. That's the thing I'm working on mostly now.
Well, I'm going to link all your links in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting, and thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blind.